Sherlock Holmes, The Complete Novels and Stories, Volume 1. I'm actually holding Volume 2 in my hand, but I'm going to be reviewing Volume 1 today. I'm holding Volume 2 to illustrate. I don't actually have Volume 1 with me at the moment. But the cover art is exactly the same on both of these. So Volume 1 and Volume 2 just look exactly the same. If memory serves, I think Volume 1 is a little bit thicker, but it's the exact same illustration on both. So it's this book, if you happen to see it in bookstores. And you might see this in bookstores. I bought my copy way back when, in 2006, actually, in a bookstore in Fukuoka, Japan. But I still see this exact same edition on sale kind of in international airports everywhere, or just kind of, yeah, wherever. So you might well see this. This is published by Bantam Classics. I'll get to Volume 2 in another video. I'm just going to focus on Volume 1 today. But both of these volumes are a compendium. So they're a collection of the other Sherlock Holmes books. Now, Sherlock Holmes, if you didn't know, there are 4 Sherlock Holmes novels, and then there are like, I don't know, hundreds of short stories. And the short stories were collected, they were originally published in newspapers way back in the day, but then they were collected and published in collections. The collections that are in Volume 1 was 2 novels. It's The Sign of the Four, A Study in Scarlet, The Sign of the Four are the 2 novels in Volume 1. And then several short stories which were originally published as The Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, which is a short story collection, The Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, short story collection, and The Return of Sherlock Holmes, which is a short story collection. So 5 books in total in Volume 1, but essentially 2 novels and then a whole bunch of short stories. I didn't even catch this until actually just now when I was brushing up on Wikipedia, but this is slightly out of order because Volume 2 starts off with The Hound of Baskervilles, which was published in 1902, which was actually before The Return of Sherlock Holmes. But The Return of Sherlock Holmes is in Volume 1. Yeah, I don't know why they did that. My guess is they were trying to balance the novels evenly. So Volume 1 has 2 of the 4 novels and then the short stories. Volume 2 has the other 2 of the 4 novels and then the short stories. Anyways, Sherlock Holmes, right? Everybody knows about Sherlock Holmes. Like most kids, I was interested in Sherlock Holmes. I didn't know a lot about him. I had seen a couple cartoons. And I've been trying to, on the internet, track down what cartoons these were I saw as a kid. I don't even know. But they were cartoon versions of his adventures, which intrigued me. And somewhere around 11 or 12 or something, I got a copy of Sherlock Holmes out of the library and tried to read it. And really struggled with it. I could understand it, but the prose was a little bit, I felt it was a little bit stiff or hard work, or it wasn't an easy read for me. And so that put me off Sherlock Holmes for about 15 years or so. I don't know what your experience is. I've been trading stories with other people, trying to find out if they read Sherlock Holmes at a young age. And a number of them were like, yeah, I picked it up when I was 12 and I loved it. And I was like, So, a number of people are smarter or more literary than me, but I had a hard time getting through this when I was 12. And then for a long time, I was just like, nope, Sherlock Holmes is too boring, too difficult to read. But that was a mistake, because once you become an adult, it's actually quite an easy read. And I was reading The Lost World, another book by Arthur Conan Doyle, which I had bad memories of Arthur Conan Doyle, but I thought, oh, let's give this a try. And I thought, well, this is easy to read. And then I thought, yeah, I should come back to Sherlock Holmes. And then I saw these books in the bookstore. And I thought, all right, I can just pick up these 2 volumes. I mean, they're thick, but they're portable. And I could actually read all the books in the Sherlock Holmes canon. Yeah, so here I am with my review of Volume 1. Yes, the good news is it's readable. It's very readable. Put me off as a kid, but it's incredibly easy reading as an adult. So yeah, if you're like me, if you tried it as a kid and it put you off a bit, pick it up again. From an adult standpoint, it is totally readable. Yeah, so the book contains, Volume 1 contains A Study in Scarlet, The Sign of the Four, and then the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes, the Memoirs of Sherlock Holmes, and The Return of Sherlock Holmes, all of which combined are 36 short stories. Volume 1 comes to about 1,000 pages. Volume 2 is a little bit shorter. How many pages is this? 737. So after the 2 initial novels, you get into the short stories. The short stories are, they vary a little bit, but they're about 20 pages long, roughly. And 20 pages is about the perfect amount of space for a Sherlock Holmes story. So, you get the setup, you get some time looking for clues and letting the mystery simmer, but you don't have to wait too long for the payoff. In kind of one sitting, you can get to the end of the mystery. The frustration, of course, with the novels is you have to wait a bit to get to the end of the mystery. I mean, that's all part of the fun as well, of course. But, if you're an impatient person, the short stories are perfect. At the same time, though, when you're reading like a whole compendium like this, I did find it a little bit difficult to get through this book quickly. Because, I get to the end of one short story, and I'd be like, yeah, okay, I'm done for the day. Like, I couldn't quite be bothered to try and get myself into the next story, because, that's the thing with short stories. It always takes a bit of work to get yourself into the next story. But then, and as a consequence of that, it took me like several months to finish the first volume. But, there's nothing wrong with that. It's not a race. I was enjoying it as I went. It's a little hard to review this book because it's not one book, it's actually several different books. The very first novel starts off with the meeting between Holmes and Watson. They're initially roommates just out of convenience. I think a mutual acquaintance put them in touch and each was looking for a roommate. That's A Study in Scarlet. Then in the very next book, The Sign of the Four, Watson actually gets married and moves out. This is, I don't know how widely known this is. At a certain point, Conan Arthur Doyle actually got sick of writing Sherlock Holmes stories. He was kind of sick of all the public demand for them and sick of kind of churning out story after story after story. So he actually killed Sherlock Holmes off. And the final problem in which Sherlock Holmes and Moriarty both kind of go off a waterfall together. I actually didn't know that little detail as a kid. I think I found out about it in university when a university professor was talking about Sherlock Holmes. I was like, what? He actually got killed off and brought back to life? Although, nowadays, kind of maybe with all these Sherlock Holmes movies and TV adaptations, maybe that bit of trivia is a little bit more common than it was back when I was a kid. That plus the internet, right? All the spoilers are already out on the internet. But yeah, if you didn't know, there's an interesting little episode, which is where he gets killed off and then brought back to life again. Now that may have made a good place to kind of split the volumes, right? Finish volume 1 where he gets killed off, have him get brought back to life in volume 2, but it's actually all in volume 1. I think because this was all kind of relatively near the early period of Sherlock Holmes when he got killed off and brought back to life. So, about the stories. Lots of people like to read detective stories because it's, it's like an intellectual puzzle. They get to challenge their wits. You get all the clues and you see if you can kind of solve the mystery before the detective does. That's what I was kind of expecting from these Sherlock Holmes stories. I was expecting all the clues would be laid out, and then there would be like a challenge to the reader to try and solve it. Kind of like, I don't know if anyone remembers those Encyclopedia Brown books that were popular when I was a kid, or some of those other detective books where they give you the mystery and then you try and solve it, and then you flip to the back to see if you solved it correctly. Somewhat to my surprise, that is not the format of these books at all. And this is because Watson is the narrator. And Watson, as a narrator, doesn't even notice most of the clues. So Holmes is noticing the clues, but Holmes actually keeps quiet about a lot of the stuff he's noticing. Which means that the reader doesn't even have access to the clues. So the reader doesn't have an equal opportunity to solve the crime. Holmes just solves it, and then the reader gets it all at the end. I don't know, maybe that's cheating, but that's the way these books work. So what's the appeal of them then? Well, there's still an appeal in seeing like the brilliant way in which Holmes' mind works. You're not allowed to solve the case with him, but at the end he kind of goes through and outlines exactly how he solves it. And, it's quite clever, isn't it? I know this is kind of stating the obvious, but these Sherlock Holmes books really are quite clever. Arthur Conan Doyle was really quite a brilliant guy in the way he was able to kind of always kind of have Sherlock Holmes logically puzzle out all these things. I think another appeal of these stories is just the appeal of seeing the criminal get caught. This is just kind of my own theory, but I think, this is why so many of those stupid police dramas are so popular, like CSI and Law and Order. Even though there's not like a intellectual puzzle or intellectual mystery to be solved, it starts off with a murder, and you're like, oh, that's terrible. I hope they catch the guy who did this and bring them to justice. And then sure enough, by the end, they catch the guy who did it and bring it to justice, and you as the viewer kind of feel like a sense of satisfaction, like, justice has been served. I think that's somewhat of the appeal of these Sherlock Holmes books as well, or these Sherlock Holmes stories. Even though you don't get to solve the case along with Sherlock Holmes, you kind of start off with some sort of problem, and then there's a certain satisfaction in just kind of seeing the criminal caught at the end. Every once in a while, there's a couple stories in this collection where Sherlock Holmes and Watson really don't do much of anything. They're just kind of, they get called in on a case, and before they even have time to collect the clues, events will unfold, and they'll just kind of be outside observers kind of watching the events unfold. But there's still kind of the satisfaction of kind of seeing the criminal get caught at the end. That being said, not all of these stories are murder mysteries. He mixes it up a little bit. There's some love intrigues in here, missing love letters, blackmail story. At one point, in one of the stories, I guess Arthur Conan Doyle is making a little bit of fun of himself. Sherlock Holmes will even say to Watson that he feels his talents are not being used as a detective, but as some sort of relationship expert or advice columnist. I'm paraphrasing a little bit, but that's kind of the gist of the conversation. I thought, and maybe I'm going to get in trouble here with hardcore Sherlock Holmes fans, I thought the consistency of the stories between themselves was not always consistent. I said that wrong. I thought that the stories were not always consistent with each other. And I suspect maybe this is because this was like before the birth of internet and nerd culture. And you know, these stories were getting serialized in newspapers over the course of about 40 years. So people weren't always kind of catching up on all the continuity errors. But, for example, in the very early stories, Sherlock Holmes is portrayed as kind of a flawed hero. He's someone who is very knowledgeable about solving crime, but he is only concerned about the knowledge to solve crime. So he doesn't know anything else. He doesn't know anything about culture or basic science or anything like that. Just knowledge that he thinks is useful in solving criminal cases. Which was a surprise to me because I always thought, you know, Sherlock Holmes, he knows everything about everything. And I think that is kind of more how he eventually became transformed by the later stories. Or at the very least, they kind of dropped this angle of kind of emphasizing his ignorance about kind of obvious cultural stuff. Another thing that surprised me, well, actually, it didn't completely surprise me because, again, I had a college professor who had been talking about this beforehand. But it surprised me when I first found out about it, is Sherlock Holmes has like several drug addictions. And again, I think this is, he uses opium, he uses cocaine. I think these were a little bit less stigmatized in the 1890s than they are now, at least that's what my college professor said. But it was still kind of portrayed as a bad habit, like a dependency. It was something that was very prominent in the first couple stories and then just seemed to get dropped in the later stories. But yeah, it again goes to kind of Holmes being a flawed hero. Like he's brilliant, but he's got all these kind of dependencies and Watson has to kind of help him run his life. And also he's a misogynist. You know, I know misogynist is a word that gets thrown around a lot these days. But like Arthur Conan Doyle is intentionally writing him as somebody who has a negative view of women. And this is portrayed as like another character flaw of his. Again, kind of more in the early stories. Also, while I'm complaining about continuity or commenting on it, the chronology is not entirely clear. So the problem is Watson gets married at the end of the second novel, and then he's living with his wife. But Arthur Conan Doyle needs them together because Watson is the narrator, so we need Watson to narrate these cases. And Sherlock Holmes actually doesn't need Watson so much. He could go out and solve these cases by himself. So we need like an excuse for Watson to be tagging along. Now, if they're roommates, then that's the excuse right there. But then once Watson moves out, it becomes a little bit more difficult. So then there are a number of cases where Watson is married and he's living with his wife, but they're like flashback stories, like he's reminiscing about the times when he still lived with Holmes, and it turned out there are all these adventures that he and Holmes went on before he got married that we had never heard about before. And then in one story, Watson just shows up and says, yeah, Holmes, I'm moving back in with you. And unless I missed something, there was no mention of his wife. And it had been so long since his wife got last mentioned in any of these stories that maybe Arthur Conan Doyle was just figuring the reader had forgotten about her. Like I certainly felt like I'd forgotten about her by that point. All that being said, I think if you do get on the internet and go to Sherlock Holmes fan pages and stuff like that, there are people who are kind of working out kind of various theories to try and explain away some of these supposed continuity errors. If you're at all familiar with geek culture or nerd culture, this will be old news to you. You know, the way like Star Trek fans will spend an enormous amount of energy trying to explain away continuity errors in Star Trek. Similar thing seems to be happening with Sherlock Holmes nuts. Yes, so that's about all for Volume 1. I'll come back with Volume 2 someday, not anytime soon. I've got a few other things to work through first.